I first want to say thank you both so much. This feels like such an incredible opportunity for us, for the Education Week folks in the world, and then all the people that are in schools and districts, et cetera, that are really trying to understand where do we go from here?
My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I am most recently the Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning and the U.S. Department of Education, and have spent my career at the federal education level.
And I'm Jim Blew. I lead a federal policy institute known as Defense of Freedom Institute. And I was also the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. For those who don't follow the federal government, that's the Policy and Budget Office of the department.
And how do you all know each other?
It's a good question. And the reason I think I feel very comfortable doing this is Roberto and I have been working in parallel trying to improve education in this country. And one of the reasons I'm very comfortable having the discussion today is because I know about your history trying to improve things for the same children I'm trying to improve things for. And yet we have come to different conclusions about how to approach that. But probably 20 years we've known each other.
I think that's right, yeah. And I really value all the contributions you've made, Jim, over the years to help support our public education system. And you were such a wonderful resource as I was assuming the role in the Biden-Harris administration that you had held during the Trump administration,
right.
The first Trump administration.
And I was wholeheartedly behind all of the efforts you were making to reopen our schools and to get kids back into classrooms. It was very important. And it was a culture shift at the time, and I was afraid it wasn't going to happen. So I very much appreciated that.
And when you say at the time, do you mean during COVID? Is that what you're talking about?
I know it was after COVID. The time I'm talking about is after we had already, we had our vaccines.
Oh.
Most schools were already opening, but there were still some holdbacks, and you guys pushed on that in a very productive way.
Right. The American Rescue Plan was one of the hallmarks there. And
yes.
We spent the better part of our first 2 years of the administration really helping to shepherd and implement that funding from Congress.
And we certainly spent our last year from the CARES Act, March
Yes.
2020, right through the end of our term, completely focused on that. So, yeah.
So I'd love you each to tell each other briefly what your K-12 education experience was like as a kid. How would you describe the experience?
Well, I had a really wonderful experience in public education as a kid. And I think a lot of that has animated my orientation to policymaking and to supporting our field, really centering opportunity, because that was what my education gave me. I was challenged in an academically rigorous environment. I had strong community ties as a kid that carried over into my school. And I'm the son of public school educators, right? So my mother was a district administrator. My father spent his career as a counselor in career and technical education. So the love of learning and the importance of high quality public education was kind of instilled in me from an early age.
Yeah. You may not know this, but my father was also an educator. He was a PhD in history who taught in the lowest income high school in Los Angeles. And as a result, I went to my local public school. At the time, it was terrific. I had a great experience. I didn't understand that I was getting a mediocre education until I went off to college. And for that was a startling event for me. I think a lot of people go through this. And so for me, I already had an inclination that things were not going so well for most kids in this country. But I then went to, frankly, elite schools and then went off into a career that had nothing to do with education, partly because my dad had been an educator. And I watched how hard that job was. And so.
Right now, Linda McMahon's charge, according to President Trump, is to dismantle the Department of Education. If you could just respond to that, great idea, bad idea, what you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm really concerned with President Trump's plan to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, because I really believe the department has been a beacon for supporting educational opportunity and the role of education to global competitiveness and to building an equitable society, right? Those are themes that are at the heart of the department's mission. They've been at the heart of the mission for over 40 years.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that there aren't efforts that need improvement at the U.S. Department of Ed, but the department has really been a strong partner and a reliable partner with states, with local school communities, with our colleges and universities in carrying out and implementing the federal role in education and the federal dollars that come from Congress, right? It enforces over 5 statutes, important statutes like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as you know, Jim, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and the Higher Ed Act, among others. And it also fulfills an important role of equal access, of making sure that the civil rights laws across our country are well implemented in our schools, and that parents have an opportunity to rely on the department to enforce those laws, as well as to enforce our privacy laws, our student privacy laws, the FERPA program. So, I think our state leaders and many of our school leaders rely on the department, not for all the answers, but for guidance, for ideas, for the dissemination and the diffusion of evidence into our system.
Right.
And that's a really important function if we're going to set out to really lead the world with respect to an excellent public education system for all. We still have a long way to go to reach that charge, as the NAEP data has reminded us. I know you've paid close attention to that too. But the federal role in education is an important role in education, not to supplant or take the place of states or districts, but to be a partner with states and districts in helping our schools live up to their potential for all kids.
Yeah. So I appreciate the question around Trump's efforts to dismantle the department. Let's all remember what he is trying to do, and what he articulates is improving student outcomes by moving power over education out of the federal government and restoring it to states and families.
Right.
And so, first of all, I think anyone who hears this needs to understand that this is going to happen, that the president has decided that this will happen. He has a great deal of influence, at least right now, in the Republican Party. Linda McMahon is committed to doing it. And so what I think the most productive conversation we can have is, you laid out 5 great things that the federal government has a legitimate role in, and Congress has agreed that it has a legitimate role. And how can we do those things without a centralized department, without a Secretary of Education? We could also debate whether it's a good idea or not to have a department, but I think we both agree these roles need to continue. And how do you do it in a way that it's most effective partnership with states? I do want to just sort of acknowledge all those roles that you laid out. Congress has been on board with those since 1965, long before there was a department.
Right.
And now I think we're going to have to figure out a way that we shift authority and power. And like the most obvious way to do that is to cut all the strings, turn the money into a block grant, and in sincere partnership, trust our partners to use the money well at the state level. So we're going to have going from having one big department to having 51, 54, however you want to count them. And that is a entrusting of the states to do the right thing that I think makes reformers like us a little uncomfortable. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we do have, we have to acknowledge the current system, right? We have 50 states that are administering public education. And, I know that the current administration's mantra is to return education to the states. Right. The reality is Congress has taken steps over the years to elevate and empower the state role in education. You know, the most recent reauthorization of ESEA back in 2015 was an important step in that direction. But there is still an important federal role to be played. And I have real trouble envisioning a government, a federal government, that does not have a single agency dedicated to the quality and the opportunity that we need to provide all of our kids in public education, right?
Yeah.
That's why we have the Department of Education. That's not to say that there aren't reforms that are needed. And I know that the administration has already taken really bold steps to eliminate or lay off half of the staff at the U.S. Department of Education, arguing a smaller federal role. But it's still important that we have a federal role. And I think Congress will, as you mentioned, the president signed the executive order, but it's up to Congress, to be clear, to determine whether the department continues to exist or not. It's
Absolutely.
not something that the president has said he's going to do unilaterally.
Right.
So there will be a robust debate in Congress about the future federal role in education. I hope that we can find some agreement around the importance that the federal role can play next to states and next to 15,000 diverse and wonderful school districts that are governed by their school boards and by their local communities and by the voices of their parents in rural areas,
right,
in urban areas, and suburban areas around the country. That is the beauty of our American education system. There's an important role to play at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And we just need to harmonize that and get that right so that our kids can reap the benefits.
Right, but let's turn this a little more concrete here.
Yeah.
You believe there needs to be a cabinet level education secretary, full-on department. What I think we're proposing is that it be an office buried within HHS, for example, with the
Right.
elementary and secondary education funding. I don't think the states will mind just getting the money and keeping all the federal rules and regulations out of it. I think many of them will welcome that, right? And so for a practitioner out there, do you really care if the money comes from a cabinet level office, department, or from an office within HHS? And I think the answer is no, that they don't care. They just really want the money and the ability to do things more innovatively than our current rules allow.
Well, I do think we need to support states in their efforts to lead innovation, right, and to lead change. And the question to be debated is, what's the best structure to do that? And is it possible to support that innovation alongside the dual objective of the integrity of our laws, right? The integrity of carrying out, for instance, IDEA, which is a statute that doesn't just tangentially support our students with disabilities. It fulfills our students with disabilities' constitutional right to a free and public education, right? Their constitutional right to least restrictive environment, to not being segregated as they were prior to the passage of that law, in 1975, but to actually be integrated in our schools. So the question is, can the integrity of those types of laws and the Perkins Law around career and technical education and ESEA and the rights of our English learner population and many other diverse populations, can we uphold those if there's no Department of Education? I think an office at HHS, knowing the HHS structure, would be really ill-equipped to be able to have the expertise and deliver the supporting guidance that our states depend on and our schools need to be able to carry forth those laws well.
And here's where I think we do have a disagreement. You think the states depend on, rely on, and there's a lot of evidence to support you because they're absolutely frozen until we give them the guidance from the Department of Ed to follow the law as it was just written, right? And to me, that feels like it's all unnecessary. The better approach would be to say, the law. We actually know states want to serve students with disabilities, economically disadvantaged students. Just allow them the money so that they can do that better than they are doing right now, which we haven't gotten into the burden that the federal department causes. You know, we hear estimates that 50% of the money that's going out on Title I, for example, Title I of the elementary and secondary, 50%, 60% is being spent on compliance rather than serving the students. And so my argument would be give them the money, let them spend it the way they think is best, and it is going to differ state to state because these are different environments, and it should differ because they're different environments, right? And so to me, that is a better use of federal taxpayers and will lead to better student outcomes.
Yeah. Well, so with respect to teacher professional development and elevating and building the teaching workforce, this is, I think, one of the most fundamentally important things we can do as a country for our education system, but more importantly for our students, right? There's no shortcut to building a thriving and talented teaching profession. And all the other countries around the world that are outpacing us educationally have really focused on the role of the teacher. So, you know, again, that's not, there's no federal one-size-fits-all prescription for supporting a great teacher in every classroom. But there are steps that we can take, and we need to take as a federal government, I believe, to invest in that endeavor, right? Steps to improve teacher pre-service and how our teachers are trained even before they reach the classroom. And, you know, investing in teacher residencies and opportunities to help more of our teachers get to the classrooms where they're needed. We have a national teacher shortage still as a country. You know, I was really proud to work when I was in the Biden administration on supporting an apprenticeship model for teachers, which now is recognized in almost all 50 states as a more streamlined learn and earn model to attract talent into the profession. I think we also have to make sure that once our teachers get into the classroom, that they have the support, the mentorship, the professional learning that they need to be able to succeed. And clearly we need to do better there, right? I think we need to listen more to the voices of our teachers and give them more agency in that work. And make sure that they're well trained to be able to and well prepared to be able to do what works in education, right? We are still, and I know this is a concern of yours too, Jim, just so, you know, for so many years we've been wrestling with this achievement gap in reading and in math. And again, the most recent NAEP scores, I believe, are a clarion call for us to double down on high quality instructional materials, evidence-driven approaches like science of reading in our schools, alongside extra academic support for our kids, tutoring, the before and after school time learning, opportunities for supporting their advancement, supplemental opportunities. All of those are things that take resources and take leadership from, I believe, from our states and districts, but also from the federal government to invest there. That's why we've invested, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in Title II to support some of those efforts. And some of those grants have been canceled more recently, but I hope that we can find some support and agreement on a bipartisan basis for supporting teacher effectiveness.
Where I think we should start is that we agree that we're underperforming as a nation right now.
Yes.
We should get more concrete in case the viewers don't know that. Even though they're practitioners, they may not understand that our students with disabilities, for example, have horrible outcomes and performance on the NAEP test. The other thing that Congress agreed it would serve would be economically disadvantaged children. And even though nationwide, we have about a third of our students who are not even reading at a basic level, a basic grade level. In low-income communities, it's closer to 60%. So 3 out of 5 children are not being served well. I once was very excited about the role that the federal government could play. I mean, you know my history here. I'm going back to even with Bill Clinton and Goals 2000. We're going to set higher standards. We're going to have charter schools. We're going to. I thought that was productive. W comes along, joins with Ted Kennedy, who you used to work for, and they say, well, we have learned from what states are doing about achievement testing. We're going to impose that on the nation. NCLB, the No Child Left Behind Act, that actually created a backlash that was shared by both the labor unions that represent teachers and parents
Yeah.
who thought that some of the curriculum attached to that was, but I was still excited even as Arnie came in, Arnie Duncan.
In the Obama administration.
And the Obama administration and race to the top and all of that. I still thought, well, this could lead to something, right? They're using the levers to actually achieve some good reforms out in the states. But again, all it caused was a backlash, and we end up with ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is just the latest authorization of ESEA.
Yeah.
Where the Congress has already started this process where they're taking the federal government out of it. There's still requirements, but they're far fewer than were under NCLB. There are no, you don't have any of the interventions that NCLB had. And so on this issue around ESEA, and we'll come back to teachers in a second, I think Congress and I think the country is feeling we need to get power over those things back. Federal government, we really appreciate you. We especially appreciate the money. So please give us that, but don't give us any more rules and regs. Let us figure this out for ourselves to improve student outcomes, which I think we want to see, but most people in DC think we might know better how to do that than the locals. And I just think we have to trust the locals on this. The federal role in teacher preparation improvement, I think, is a sincere one, but it's actually an example for me of how it hasn't worked very well. Your program is one of the few exceptions, and it's been picked up by states to make it successful, right? And maybe we need an incubator for that kind of thing, but maybe it doesn't need to be at the federal government. Maybe philanthropy can do these kind of things. My point is, we spend a ton of money on professional development for teachers. I hear numbers $16,000, $17,000 a year. So the piece that the federal government is adding to that pie is pretty small, and it hasn't changed. Like, we still have lots of teachers who do not know how to instruct reading, who do not know how to bring kids up to proficiency in math. And again, my appeal would be, let's try this new thing where we give power back to local communities, families, so they can have more of a say in this and maybe make some progress. If I had seen a lot of changes, improvements in student outcomes over the last 30 years, I might have a different feeling about it. But at this point, I'm like, let's try it, because the federal stuff hasn't worked.
I think I kind of view the federal role in education, and you did a brilliant job, Jim, of unpacking that at least from No Child Left Behind forward, even the IADA, which was the version of that law under Clinton.
Right.
But, I really view that as an evolution, right? And I think what we saw, and I worked on No Child Left Behind with Senator Kennedy when George Bush made that his hallmark priority. The beauty of that moment was that you had a strong consensus on a bipartisan basis that public education was an important hallmark for our country's economic competitiveness and for the individual advancement of communities. And you had, I think, a really wonderful focus on its importance for our future. It's tied to economic competitiveness moving forward. And that evolved. I know there was a lot of mandates, a lot of kind of prescription in that process. That was part of standards-based reform. President Obama, when I was in the White House, we continued that process quite argently, particularly with Race to the Top, and then ESSA came along. President Obama called ESSA a Christmas miracle when it was passed, right? Because it was passed, remember, in his last year in office, and it was by the virtue of bipartisan members of Congress working together. We actually stepped back and got out of the way at the White House and let Congress come together and say, let's right the ship here, let's evolve this law so that states have a stronger voice and districts have a stronger voice in the remedies, the interventions, what worked and happened in classrooms when we saw underperformance. But what it got right was maintaining the guardrails, maintaining a focus on every student, which, remember, before No Child Left Behind, we had 35 states that didn't even track the progress of every student. So you have a permanent underclass of students in our public education system. So it maintained some of that accountability, and it returned a lot of the power and decision making to the states. Now, there's an apparatus that, as you know, at the Department of Education, that's existed all the way back to its founding, that goes back and forth with states, provides them flexibility in how they implement, and states petition for flexibility with particular programs. It's an involved process, but it is a process, it's one that works. I think if you ask the majority of state school chiefs that run their departments, does the process you have right now with the Department of Education give you the tools you need to steer your federal dollars in the directions you want as a state? I think a majority of those chiefs will say yes.
You are talking to a different set of chiefs than I am.
Not all of them,
yes.
And I know we've had some that have said we want to return power. I think it's really important that as we have this conversation around devolution of authority, we don't lose sight of the importance of every child succeeding.
Right.
And without a federal role that is currently in the law in ESEA to do that and to make sure we're gathering the data around student progress for all students, not just for some of our students, that we're helping to push out the evidence around what works. Because you're absolutely right. Some places are teaching reading the right way, some places aren't. So the federal, we wouldn't know about the science of reading if it weren't for the Institute of Education Sciences at the Department of Ed, right? They're the ones who published the studies that said this is how you should be teaching reading, right? So we talk about, the Mississippi Miracle, which a lot of people talk about as, wow, they did such a great job turning reading around. It wasn't a miracle. It was actually by virtue of great leadership by Carrie Wright there, and by the governor, by the Republican governor there, to say what's important here is to do what works and to practice that. And I'm glad that we have a department that helps to support that work.
So you mentioned all of the hundreds of millions of dollars of research that went into the science of reading. You're right, we wouldn't have had those raw materials. We only know about it because of Emily Hanford and her sold the story. So there is a disconnect where IES had become a bit of a bubble where it would create all kinds of great materials, but it never got converted into the practitioner's hands, where most teachers still are not taught the science of reading in their professional development to get a credential, right? And so things move slowly with that, and I don't want to it was very important. And it was important that Congress said everybody needs to be testing kids through 3rd through 8th grade, once in high school, on the core subjects. I think the culture has changed and that will continue even if Congress didn't insist on it. You and I know that politically they're likely to insist on it. But I think that we've had enough of a shift where people see, and particularly during the Spellman's years, we did see a run-up in student achievement from using those tools.
Yes, we did.
And it petered out when CESA happened, right? And so there's enough of an experiment there that states should be embracing that and doing it themselves without the federal government prodding them and forcing them to go through the iterative process of getting the flexibility to spend the money. Let's just give them the money up front.
So the current proposals that we're seeing from the Trump administration are animated by this principle of return power to the states. And again, I will just argue that states have quite a bit of power and authority over their education system, as well as local school districts, 15,000 school districts that are governed locally by communities, as it should be, right? That's the unique and beautiful thing about our American education system, which differs entirely from the rest of the world, where everything is controlled at the national level, down to curriculum. We actually have a prohibition against curriculum and against government control over what happens in classrooms. and we abide by that at the federal level very carefully. But the concern about eliminating the Department of Education and eliminating the role in education of the federal government is that you have then 50 states that are really unaccountable to any entity at the federal level around their administration of important laws, right? The ESEA, IDEA, the Higher Education Act for our colleges and universities, and our civil rights laws, right? Our civil rights laws that make sure that students are not discriminated against, our civil rights laws that make sure that we're providing equal access for all, and a place for parents to go to when they see things going awry at the local level. That isn't to question the intention of our state and local leaders. I believe that the intention of our state and local leaders to provide a great education to every student is at the heart of why they do their work.
Yeah.
I just, having worked across the states over 25 years, in red states and blue states, in urban communities and rural communities, I see a passion for our students and our communities and their families. But they need support and they need accountability.
Right.
And that is something that the federal government delivers that, and I think could do even better delivering, especially when it comes to providing the evidence around what works. And not mandating a one-size-fits-all, but suggesting and providing guidance around how to get better results, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all after here.
Right. So it's helpful, I think, for people to understand more history and context here. All of the laws, the federal laws affecting K-12 education, are the result of a local egregious failure, civil rights being the first one. It was very clear to Congress at the time that there was some behavior, bad behavior, particularly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, around respecting people's civil rights. So they enacted a law, and that's been enforced ever since 1980 through the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. I don't think you'll hear anyone talking about getting rid of the Office for Civil Rights. They're talking about moving it, probably along with the money, over to HHS. And to me, that fulfills the federal role, particularly given how far the country has come since 1965. I'm not arguing that we're there yet. We don't have racial justice in this country even today, but we're certainly much closer to it. And so having that role demoted, so it's not at the, at a Department of Ed, but rather within a larger department, feels like the right solution. It feels like the right solution to the chiefs I talk to. Like, yes, they believe it needs to be done, but does it need to be done by a federal Department of Education with the Secretary of Education?
Mm-hmm.
You could make it's worth observing IDEA, I'm old enough to have been in school when IDEA passed, and we were not treating our students with disabilities as if they deserved a free, appropriate public education.
Right.
Nobody's talking about getting rid of IDEA. They're only talking about moving the money more efficiently to states. But I can also say there's been a culture shift since 1972, 74, whenever it was passed, that is remarkable, and that I think states are now positioned culturally to say we can do better with our students with disabilities because we're not doing so. I mean, yes, we have more rights, and there's a very litigious, bureaucratically complex, frustrating process now for parents in particular to get their students served. There must be a way to streamline that to make it work more effectively. I don't think that can come out of Washington, D.C.'s Beltway. I think it has to come out of the local communities.
Yeah. And, I do think the challenge when you block grant a set of funds, right, which is kind of the proposal that we're seeing now to say, let's take, I think, actually pieces of the budget were being sent up today to Congress.
I haven't seen it, but yes, I heard that.
Just starting to record this, including kind of how do we consolidate 18 programs into one big block grant. We have block grants at the federal level, right? I think we have programs like the Child Care and Development Block Grant. which are mechanisms to get dollars into the hands of states, but are not effective mechanisms, many will argue, I think, to provide for the health, the safety, the well-being of students, or in that case, children, served by those dollars, right? There are egregious, we won't get into those conversations today, but egregious examples of abuse in, even through CCDF, the child care program. So the worry here is if we essentially paper over and devolve the guardrails, the requirements, and the subsequent regulations that the department promulgates under our laws for education, for public education, and send a blank check, or not a blank check, a check to our states and wish them well, we are going to see abuses in the system. We're going to see students lost and left behind. We are going to lose the monitoring that we need, that the current Department of Education diligently conducts to make sure that the accountability and the letter of the law is met for all students. And that matters. That matters for students. It matters for their parents and for their families. And again, that's not to cast aspersions on our education system, which I think does its best, but it needs a partner, right? I think that's the argument here, is that it needs a dedicated federal agency and a partner with the expertise, with the research, and with the technical assistance to support those.
So let's be clear, nobody's talking about getting rid of that monitoring, having the civil rights enforcement continue.
Yeah.
Where it gets placed is a little bit, those are
The
technical
placement.
questions.
Yeah.
None of that is going to change. So for practitioners on the ground, you can't suddenly start avoiding all your civil rights laws. They are still going to be in effect, and they're still going to be enforced. There is another side of this coin, and it's particularly worrisome among conservatives right now. And it's what we watched Catherine Lehman, the former assistant secretary, do with her enforcement. And it felt to a lot of people that it was pursuing some theories, critical theories, transgender theories, that were out of step with the average American. Like, we have our civil rights laws. They, for example, prohibit discrimination based on sex under Title IX
Yes.
of the Education Act. The Biden administration, and I think it's because of that assistant secretary, pursued a very radical view of how to treat transgender rights. And those overcame the rights of women, a lot of people felt, particularly in women's sports. Suddenly they are being forced to compete with transgender females, males who've at least declared that they want to be the other sex. And so that was, there is a danger of somebody weaponizing, if you will, our civil rights laws for a purpose that feels really uncomfortable for a lot of the country. And it may be, let's also acknowledge some of the reason there's pressure to push power back down to the states was overreach, and particularly in the civil rights area, that made a lot of political officials, families, voters uncomfortable.
So I want to respond a bit to the conversation we're having on civil rights, but before that, just to the question of the practical effect of eliminating the U.S. Department of Education, it's not as simple as moving dollars and authority from one agency to another. What we've seen from the effects of these layoffs is over half of the Department of Education, gone, right? That's thousands of people who have lost their jobs, but also lost the opportunity to be resources to our state and local leaders in their partnership around how to advance student achievement and success. And diminishing the department and diminishing education even further at the federal level down to a small office within HHS, there won't be the capacity to do the monitoring, to support the research, the best practices, the guidance that the field needs, to even have basic questions answered around what's allowable and what's not allowable under the present laws, the statutes that I mentioned before. So that's the real concern here, beyond the diminishing the mission of the department, which is an important one around global competitiveness and equal access. Equal access is critical when it comes to civil rights laws. All means all when it comes to enforcing our civil rights laws and making sure that every student has access to a high quality education, has access to the curriculum, has access to sports, has access to all the guarantees that our federal civil rights laws provide. And we're hard-fought, hard-won guarantees. And so I'm proud of the track record that we've had to enforce that. I'll say also the enforcement of Title VI is an important hallmark there too. And that's one where I have real worries about what we've seen from the current administration with respect to trying to mandate government approach and government control over things like equity and inclusion and diversity initiatives at the local level. And I understand that there are policy prerogatives and policy preferences of the Trump administration to say we don't like how DEI has played out. That's a fair conversation to have. But to threaten states to require that they certify to the secretary in 10 days that they will eliminate any efforts related to diversity
To be
or
clear,
inclusion.
any illegal efforts.
Illegal efforts.
Yeah.
But that the illegal standard is one that is purely subjective. And this Department of Education, I think, in their read of that legality, has applied the Harvard versus Fair Students for Admission decision, which is a decision about the use of race in college admissions,
Right.
to say that decision applies to the entirety of our K-12 system. And if you're doing anything that could be perceived or could be experienced as being different for a racial group, that could run afoul of DEI and could put all of your resources at jeopardy. So for me, that I worry about Black History Month. I worry about signs around welcoming and inclusive environments for students. I worry about affinity groups.
Yeah, I would say that's
and-
speculative and fear-mongering, because there is a difference. You can have affinity groups as long as no one is excluded from it, right? It's when you start saying, we have to have equal opportunity, equal access, and as soon as you start saying you can't come because you happen to be a white cisgender male, right? Then it gets to these more difficult questions, and those are, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
those are nuances, and I didn't mean to
nuances.
interrupt you, but I also don't want anybody to think that there isn't thoughtful legal theory behind what's being done right now. Right?
And I appreciate the nuances you draw here, Jim, but I don't think those have been disseminated or communicated with our states or our districts in
Right.
ways that they can understand, right? So the questions arise around what's taught, how history is taught, what curriculum looks like. I do believe at the end of the day, parents and communities want environments where students are welcomed and where they belong and where we are teaching history according to facts and in ways that sometimes are uncomfortable, but that don't diminish people, actually help to provide an inclusive and affirming view and an important view of how our nation took shape. But all of that, to some degree, comes under threat when there are really broad pronouncements to say we're eliminating DEI in all of our schools, however DEI is defined, right? And without that clear guidance, and then there's kind of this question of, well, what's allowed, right? And I come to that point because the administration is using its civil rights laws and that authority to try to make that pronouncement in the field.
Right. We need to be fair here, and so I acknowledge all your points. There are lots of people around the country who felt that when your administration started insisting on DEI being added to everything, that it led to some of these illegal efforts, right? So there's probably a bipartisan middle ground here. My experiences are the same as yours.
Yeah.
Our communities can figure this out.
Yeah.
Like, you can embrace and love a transgender athlete, but you don't have to let him compete against my daughter. Right? There are lots of ways to work this out at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I think it's healthy to have these debates, and it's also healthy that we have an Office for Civil Rights that is monitoring how we treat our racial minorities, how we treat our students with disabilities, all those laws that we have, that Congress has enacted to want to make sure we pass.
Yes.
So, but we have to do it in a way that's more neutral than probably either administration has done.
So in the Biden administration, we did have a set of priorities that were put through the normal rulemaking process, right? And that were subject to public debate and public review. And one of those priorities was to promote equity, including to support things like diverse teachers, right? Mm-hmm. Where we know we have over half of our students that are students of color in our system, and yet only 24% of our teachers. So to be clear, the Biden administration used some of those priorities with specific grant competitions. It did not require everybody have a diverse teacher everywhere. It tried to help support efforts that were effective, evidence-driven to move that direction. And I think that differs a little bit from how we've seen the administration to date use DEI through the civil rights law to really exercise stronger government control over what happens about DEI in classrooms. But I do think that it's an important conversation for us to have, and hopefully we can get to a point where we're agreeing on the value of diversity and the value of inclusion and the benefits of belonging to all students, because gosh knows we have a lot of research that shows that's the case.
So let's acknowledge up front that recently the Institute for Educational Sciences was hollowed out by DOGE. And that's done. It's an opportunity to rebuild even better than what we had before. I've been very pleased to hear the Secretary and others say some of the very important data collections are going to continue. Mm-hmm. Common Core data, NAEP will continue. We understand that several of the private school survey, those kinds of things will also continue. Even those, I think we can acknowledge, because we've worked with them, can be made better. There were just a lot of data points, a very difficult collection process that nobody ever used, right? And so I think we can streamline that, we can do it better. I like to think of this now as an opportunity, now that the hollowing out has happened. We also have to rethink all of the research that's being done. So much of it was never read by anyone. And we just need to be more focused about finding things that work in a context. We also need to understand return on investment. These kinds of questions that IES had not focused on. So there has to be some more thought given to how we rebuild all that. I understand, and I hope I'm not revealing some secret, but the department is on the cusp of figuring out leadership for a new effort in that area. And I'll be watching it closely. Because you and I think this is another area of agreement. Like, the federal government is really the sole opportunity to collect data from all the states in a coherent, consistent manner, right? So we need to rebuild that. And it's not even all that expensive. It got to be expensive because it got inefficient, ineffective. But I think we can do much better this time.
Data collection and evidence building and evidence dissemination are such important roles. Yeah. I think we agree at the federal level. Those roles need to be continued. Our field depends so deeply on those roles. And I also agree with your point in that, like, so much of what had been produced by IES, much of that was not read by the field in large part. It was not reaching all the audiences it needed to. That wasn't because there wasn't a strategy. I just think that strategy needed additional attention and revision, and that's part of the evolution of IES. I worked on in 2002 on the Education Sciences Reform Act, and that was an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats to come together and say, we want to evolve the role of research at the federal level beyond thinking about research improvement efforts to stronger evidentiary standards around what works.
And that happened as a result of that bill.
That happened as a result of that bill. And, I hope that we will continue to strengthen and rebuild the Institute for Education Sciences, because there is a congressional mandate to have that. That is a bill that is actively being discussed in Congress, as is the NAEP required by law. But so much of what we lost, 90% of the staff, Jim, it was a large number of leaders in this space to build evidence that were eliminated as part of the DOGE effort. And my worry is we lose the focus on data collection, on evidence dissemination, and then we're fighting closing the achievement gap with a hand tied behind our backs, because we are not doing as a country what the world does, which is to study what works and make sure that its classrooms and its leaders at the local level are armed with that information to be able to make good decisions about what curriculum they choose or how they teach reading or mathematics, which we haven't talked about yet. But we have 40% of our 8th graders who are not performing math at basic levels. This is a clarion call in a national crisis, I believe, in reading and in math. We have to get back to that work. And we're not going to get there without a strong federal role, I would say, in data collection and in evidence building and evidence dissemination.
Right. And a focus on dissemination to practitioners, people who are making decisions at the district level about the best programs to use.
Right.
Unfortunately, IES had drifted away from that mission. They were doing other kinds of research that I'm sure are important academically, but they weren't being productive in the field.
There's also an element here around statistics, and we should have a statistical arm that is the NCES, and we've lost the Commissioner for Education Statistics as part of the DOGE effort. I sure don't want to lose the ability, the sophistication, that is deep analysis and deep statistical work that the Department of Education needs to be leading, so that the country knows where we are, so we have the knowledge of where we need to go. And we don't want to set the clock back on that.
No, but we do want to find a way to do it faster, better, cheaper. And I think that is the opportunity we have, and I hope we take it. If we're still doing what we did 20 years ago, where it was cutting edge, then we're going backwards a couple of decades. I think there's much more sophisticated opportunities for us now.
When it comes to AI or artificial intelligence, this is such a dynamic force in our society and in our communities, and it is transforming how students engage with their friends, in their lives, and with their learning. And the rapid evolution of AI, we dealt with this quite a bit in the Biden administration, needs a foundation of safety, of security, and of privacy that communities and schools can trust. And from there, I think the potential to harness AI to actually transform the instructional core is so limitless. And in my conversations with our state school leaders and with local superintendents and principals, I think we've moved from a moment of kind of avoidance of AI as yet another passing fad in education technology to saying, no, we actually want to think about AI, but we need help to shape a school policy that works. We need help to know what tools are effective, because there are over 150 tools, ed tech tools, that are in the lives of our students every year in their classrooms. So what works, what doesn't work? And how can we think about supporting our state and local districts to that end? This is the AI and Future of Teaching and Learning report we published just 2 years ago now to help kind of build a bit of that framework. I think we can learn a lot from states that are putting in place some good, responsible use policies and encouraging their districts and their schools to support AI literacy. But I hope that Congress also can take that up, because we need more resources and more support to make that happen well.
Yeah. So here we do have a difference. I think we agree AI is going to be transformative. I think it will change the teacher's job. It'll probably make it much more manageable, but you don't get rid of any teachers. It just allows
I
them
agree with that.
to do more. The question then becomes, how do we let this technology evolve? Do we try and manage it from the federal government? I have some fears about that because I've watched other federal processes get politicized. It's my same concerns about NK, the DARPA for Ed, for example, that at the end of the day, that means the federal government is choosing winners and losers, and I would rather have the invisible hand of the market, have states, have districts figure out what's working best for them rather than to have it imposed. So what I do think will happen is that this task force that's been formed under this EO, I don't want to presume too much here because they have a process they go through. They'll have 120 days to go through it. But I think at the end of the day, their most effective answer to this would be, let's study what's going on and be transparent about what we're learning. What's effective, what's not, what is cost effective, what's not. And that will allow the federal government to play a useful role, but it's one of transparency and research, not imposing whatever the committee members want to impose on the country.
Right. I do hope that the commitment to research is a real one here in this EO, because I have seen other places, NSF, where we've gotten rid of 100 research studies that have looked at what's working in STEM, right? Or, as we were just discussing, the hollowing out of IES. But if we can focus on the research around what works, if we can put the voices of parents and educators, bake that into the effort, right? Make sure that, the big divide that we have is not that we don't know how to use AI well in schools or in classrooms, it is diffusion. It is the classic challenge of innovation in our education system, in that we have pockets here and there, but we haven't democratized the ability to use technology and to enable innovation well and effectively.
Right.
And maybe this is an opportunity to think more about that.
Right, and we haven't talked about the safety piece of this. There are some, as with any technology, some serious dangers presented by AI. Some of them are just truly horrifying.
Yes.
Not that I'm not sure I believe that there will be AI beings that will be controlling us, but there are some doomsday scenarios here. And I think that's actually a larger question for Congress to deal with education being part of their thought. But I wouldn't want the Department of Ed being the regulator of that. The message I hope people take from this conversation is that we can and should continue following our federal roles, but we don't need a Department of Education or the symbolism of an education secretary to do that.
My worry about the moment that we're in is that with a diminishment and a further diffusion of the federal role in education and of the Department of Education, with what we've seen with respect to the massive layoffs and the diminishment of the staff and of the work, that my biggest worry is that we won't as a country prioritize public education and prioritize the advancement of our kids the way we need to. I worry that our conversation right now, what we're seeing emerge at the federal level, is so focused on litigating DEI rather than on solving our achievement gap in reading and math, is so focused on changing the faculty and the practices at our colleges and universities rather than opening the doors of that higher education system for our students. That we're not getting to the solutions that we need to be able to build the workforce. And we need a strong Department of Education, an independent federal agency with the secretary to be able to support that work. And alone it can't do that. It actually has to support tangentially our state leaders and our local leaders to be able to make those opportunities happen for kids.
People are losing track of how important the federal role is in this. our K-12 systems are just about to get slammed with some really severe challenges that are much bigger than whether the department goes away or not, particularly if the money keeps flowing. I'll start with the COVID money is gone.
Yes.
And people didn't plan for that very well. And so we're going to see a lot of districts challenged with, now how do I go from having $190 billion worth playing with to zero, right? So there's that. We're probably heading into a recession. We can talk about the problems that might have caused that. But the fact is that our school districts do horrible in a recession. So they're going to see that happening. We're also going to see a decline in enrollment, which is happening across the country in a way that really hurts, particularly the way if states are letting money follow a child and their children not coming to school because they're not alive, they were never born, then they're going to face some big problems. So I also worry that that context is getting lost, that there's some groups that have a political interest in focusing on what's happening in the Department of Ed to distract from the real problems. Here's another one, special ed. We're seeing a spike in special ed, which we might agree is due to poor reading instruction, but it costs more money when you go that route. And so all the pressures on the system, you know the numbers, like if you focus on the 26 million children in this country who are economically disadvantaged, the federal government's contribution to them is about $700 a year versus the $20,000 we're spending. So it's about 3%. So I do wish that people would understand that context, because it would allow them to back out and say, wait a second, why are we talking about this when we have much more serious problems?
Right, but at the core of that, and all of those dynamics and challenges are very real, Jim, I couldn't agree more. I think at the core of that is a question of what's the importance of education as a domestic priority, as a national priority to this administration, to our president, and what's the agenda to get there, right? And so far that agenda has been to eliminate the Department of Education, and now to propose a budget that cuts education, right? That will cut support for our schools and cuts support for higher education, cuts TRIO programs, cuts other programs. So it's, we're debating here, I think, a little bit of theories of action around where the federal role should fit, but there's a bigger question here about the importance of education in the moment we're in. And boy, as we all know that, some tough economic times might be coming, the disruption that portends for our schools, who have faced once in a lifetime disruption with COVID, that we're just now trying to, emerge from. I think, now is a time where we need a strong partner, a reliable partner at the federal level to support our state and local leaders. I think that's what's at the core of this. And now is a time when we need more resources to be able to, and resources steered well, right? Resources steered in the right direction. But certainly more resources to support implementing the evidence-driven practices that we know can work, can help our districts get through that recession.
Right. And remember, his theory isn't that we need to dismantle the Department of Ed. It is so that we can move power back to the states, local communities, and families. Yeah. Therefore, we need to get rid of the department. It's that it is a means to an end for him.
Yeah. I think you can do that with a good Department of Education. So we can agree to disagree on that front.
So I am hopeful that if we rejigger the federal role once again, reducing it further, that states will pick up the opportunity, innovate, and actually begin to move the needle again on reaching the children. You and I have worked together to try and help for 20, 30 years, right?
Yeah, I'm hopeful for a moment where we can return to a bipartisan solution for steering our public education system forward. I am a creature of that commitment from President Bush with Ted Kennedy to say, we're going to work together to reform and to provide the resources that our system needs to thrive. We haven't gotten all the way there, right? That's the great American experiment that continues to need to be done. But I'm hopeful for that, and what brings me encouragement every day is the leadership we see at the local level. And it's leadership in red states and in blue states, right? It is leadership that is not about politics. It's about putting our kids first and doing what's right for them in classrooms. And boy, if we could just, continue to support that leadership at the local level, we'll get there.